Life always seemed so peaceful, like everything was following its usual path. You don't really understand how fragile that feeling of normalcy is until it completely falls apart. It's strange how the simplest, most ordinary moments can spiral into total chaos. That evening started no different than any other, mundane and uneventful. I had just walked in, sweaty and tired from the gym, hoping the physical exhaustion would drown out the noise in my mind. I had no idea that no amount of heavy lifting could prepare me for what was coming. She was in the kitchen, holding a glass of wine as though it was just another typical Wednesday. The scent of her favorite lavender candles, the expensive ones, filled the room. But something felt off. Her smile was too bright, almost as if she was in on a secret joke that I wasn't part of. There was something unnatural about it. I could have asked her what was wrong right then. Maybe I should have. But instead, I grabbed a beer, leaned on the counter, and asked her, as I always did, how her day was. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. She barely glanced up, her attention glued to her phone, giving me only a lazy nod. Normally, we'd exchange a few words about our day, but that night just silence. I was ready to let it go, to brush off the growing unease I felt creeping in, but then I caught a glimpse of her phone screen. One name stood out: Mason. Not just any Mason. That Mason, a co-worker she'd mentioned a few times in recent months, always speaking of him with high praise, always enthusiastic about his ideas. I hadn't thought much of it before, it was just work, right? But now, something felt off. So I asked, keeping my tone light, what's going on with Mason? You two seem to talk a lot lately. Her reaction was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but I caught it. A brief flinch. She quickly regained her composure, but not fast enough for me to miss that tiny slip. Oh, nothing, she said too casually, too quickly. She didn't meet my eyes, and a knot tightened in my stomach. I wanted to believe her, I really did, but something about her response felt too distant, too rehearsed, like she'd practiced it. I played along, acting as though everything was fine. I nodded, shrugged, pretending to accept her explanation, but in my mind pieces were starting to come together, pieces I hadn't even realized were missing. When she said she was tired and went to bed early, I stayed up, pretending to watch TV, though my thoughts were miles away. Then, I did something I'm not proud of. I took her phone. Yes, I know how that sounds, but sometimes you just can't ignore your instincts, no matter how much you want to. What I found wasn't just innocent work-related messages. It was worse, an emotional betrayal laid bare in their texts, filled with phrases like, "I can't wait to see you again." They had plans for Friday night, the same Friday she had told me she'd be working late. It felt like my world had flipped upside down, but one thing was clear: I wasn't going to be played for a fool. If she wanted to deceive me, fine, but I was going to turn the tables on both her and Mason. As the night dragged on, sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, their words blazed in my mind, like neon signs. "I miss you last night," was amazing. "I can't wait for Friday." I'm not one to sit and drown in self-pity. No, I had a plan. And when I was finished, neither she nor Mason would know what hit them. I've always been someone who stays several steps ahead, planning everything meticulously, ensuring I miss nothing. If she thought she could outsmart me, she was in for a rude awakening. I set a deadline for Friday. 3 days to craft a plan that would turn her betrayal back on her, leaving an unforgettable impact. Believe me, I was about to set everything in motion. First, I needed to figure out whether this was purely emotional or if it had escalated further. The next day, I called in sick to work. I didn't even tell her. Let her think it was just another ordinary day. As soon as she left for the office, I got to work. I wasn't naive. She had no idea I could access our shared iCloud account, where all the photos, messages, and conversations were stored. The thing about betrayal is that people get sloppy. They become overconfident, start thinking they're invincible, that you're too blind or too dumb to see what's happening right under your nose. She was no exception. Within minutes, I had everything: photos, call logs, locations, all the dirty secrets she thought were hidden. They'd been seeing each other for 5 months, and she had the nerve to sit across from me at dinner every night, talking about her day as if nothing was wrong. But it wasn't the photos or the messages about meeting in hotels that hurt the most. No, what really got to me was how she laughed at me. "He doesn't suspect a thing," she wrote. "Told him I had to work late again. Poor guy." Poor guy. Was that what I was to her? Just some clueless fool she could string along while she enjoyed herself in another man's arms? My blood boiled. I wanted to storm into her office and tear everything apart right then and there. But no, that would have been too easy, too quick. I didn't want a brief outburst. I wanted something slower, more painful. So I reached out to Kyle, an old friend who now worked as a private investigator. We'd always been close, and he owed me a favor. It was time to call that favor in. I asked Kyle to follow her, to track her every move for a few days, and document everything. She was predictable, a creature of habit. If she thought she could hide this affair, I wanted evidence of every detail. Kyle didn't ask too many questions, he just agreed. I made sure he knew Friday was the big day, the day when things would really get interesting. While Kyle handled the surveillance, I made my own preparations at home. She thought I'd be at work, but I planned to be exactly where I needed to be watching, waiting. That evening, she came home, kissed me on the cheek, and complained about how tired she was from work. I had to fight the urge to pull away. She had no clue I'd already seen the photos of her and Mason. She didn't realize I now understood what her tired really meant. She was completely unaware that I was already setting the stage to tear her illusions apart. And here's the kicker: before heading to bed, she casually mentioned she might have to stay late at work on Friday. Something about an important team meeting. She said it without even looking at me. But I kept my voice steady and calm. "Take your time, no rush," I said, pretending to be relaxed. "I'll find something to keep myself busy." I don't think I've ever forced such a wide smile in my life, knowing that in just a few days she'd be in for a shock she'd never forget. And this wasn't going to be one of those surprises you brush off with a laugh. Friday was coming, and she had no idea I could play this game just as well. When Friday finally arrived, it felt both excruciatingly slow and yet somehow too quick. The whole week had been torture, acting like I knew nothing, pretending I couldn't feel that knife twisting in my back. But Friday wouldn't be just any day. That morning, the show began. She performed her role perfectly, just as I expected. She rose early, took a shower, and left the house looking as if she were headed to some important meeting. She wore the dress from our last anniversary, of course she did, and I couldn't help but notice how absurd it all felt. She gave me a rehearsed, fake smile as she thanked me. I watched her gather her things, pack her handbag, and glance at her phone several times, clearly waiting for a message. She even glanced at the clock a few times. "I might be home late today," she said casually, as if she'd rehearsed that line 100 times. I remained composed. "Take your time," I answered smoothly. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, I grabbed my phone. Kyle had already texted she's left. "I'll keep you updated," time crawled, but I didn't waste a second. I'd been ready for this day for quite some time. Cameras were set up in key spots: kitchen, living room, bedroom. Call it paranoia, but after what I'd discovered, I wasn't going to miss a single detail. I needed undeniable proof, not just for myself, but for when her lies finally unraveled. I was tired of being the fool. Around noon, another message from Kyle arrived. "They've met. Downtown hotel." It's confirmed. I stared at those words, letting the truth hit me. While she claimed she'd be working late, she was probably already in that hotel room with Mason. Anger surged within me, but I forced it down. Not yet. I had to stay calm. Kyle sent over a few pictures. There they were, casually walking into the hotel, as if nothing was amiss. Her hand lightly rested on his shoulder, just like any normal couple. Two people married to others, blatantly flaunting their affair. I studied the photos closely, her smile, the way she leaned into him. It was as though I didn't exist in her world anymore. The sight disgusted me, but I wasn't going to storm in and ruin their weekend. No, I had a much better plan. I waited. I paced. I rehearsed how the confrontation would play out. No yelling, no drama, at least not from me. I wanted her tangled in her own lies, and by the time she realized I knew everything, it would be far too late. Hours passed, and at 7 p.m., Kyle sent another text. She's heading home. Everything was set. I sat in the living room, casually flipping through a magazine as if nothing was wrong. The door creaked open, and she walked in, calm and collected, with no signs of guilt. Why would she be anxious? She thought she had everything under control. "Hey," she said, setting her handbag on the table. "Rough day?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She nodded. "Yeah, long day." I smiled and gestured toward the table. I made dinner. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it came, replaced by her usual smile. "Wow. You didn't have to go to all that trouble," she said, leaning in to give me a quick kiss on the cheek. The same lips that had probably been all over Mason just hours earlier. The thought made me sick, but I swallowed it. We sat down for dinner, and I let her talk. She rambled on about her day, meetings, workload. I listened, nodded at the right moments, and smiled politely. She believed she was in control, still holding on to her story. But as she spoke, I could feel the tension inside me building, like a spring coiling tighter and tighter. Then, without warning, I dropped the first bomb. "How's Mason?" I asked, cutting a piece of food as casually as I could. Her fork froze midair. The calm mask she'd worn all evening cracked. "Mason, what are you talking about?" She responded, her voice sharper than usual, too quick. "You know," I continued, leaning back in my chair, keeping my tone light. "I thought maybe he was at your meeting today. You two seem to hang out a lot." For a moment, panic flashed across her face before she quickly covered it with a nervous laugh. "Oh, him? No, he wasn't there. Just the usual team liar." I could feel the rage rising within me, but I kept my voice steady. "Really?" I asked calmly. "Because according to Kyle, my friend the private investigator, you know him? He's been following you for a few weeks, and he has a very different story." Her face went pale instantly, her wide eyes locking onto mine like a deer caught in headlights. She was scrambling, trying to figure out how she'd ended up in this trap without realizing it for days. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, dropping her fork, which clattered onto her plate. I leaned forward, my voice sharp but controlled. "I know everything. The messages, the hotel, Mason, all of it." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. For the first time in months, she was speechless, no sarcastic remarks, no dismissive gestures. She was trapped, and she knew it, and I was just getting started. We sat in a heavy silence, the weight of what I'd just revealed pressing down on both of us. She remained frozen, her mouth slightly open, as if waiting for words to come if she stayed still long enough. But I wasn't giving her the chance to recover, to come up with some flimsy excuse. "You're lying," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted toward the door, already planning an escape route. "This can't be real. There's no detective. You're just paranoid." A bitter laugh escaped my lips, low and dark, the kind of laugh that comes when everything seems too ridiculous to believe. "Paranoid," I repeated, shaking my head. "You really think I made all this up? You really think you hid everything that well?" Calmly, I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled to the photos Kyle had sent me earlier that day. Without a word, I placed the phone on the table between us, screen facing up. Her face twisted in horror as she stared at the images. There she was, hand in hand with Mason, walking into the hotel. In another photo, they were sitting at a bar, sitting too close, engrossed in conversation. I could almost see the wheels turning in her mind, desperately trying to come up with some sort of explanation. But it was over. The proof was undeniable. Her shaking fingers picked up the phone, eyes glued to the screen as she scrolled through the photos. With each new image, her face grew paler, her breathing more unsteady. When she reached the last photo, a close-up of her kissing Mason, outside the hotel, the last of her composure shattered. I can explain," she muttered, her voice thin and panicked. "It's not what you think, I swear. We didn't do anything," she stammered, her voice shaky. "We were just talking, just a conversation that was the story she wanted me to buy." Rage boiled inside, but I held it back. I needed to stay calm, let her try to justify herself, let her squirm. "Talking," I echoed, my tone icy and detached, leaning in closer. "That's your explanation? Nothing else happened?" She nodded, her eyes wide with unmistakable fear, resembling a trapped animal. "It was only emotional," she said, as if that somehow lessened the damage. I never wanted it to go this far. Her words felt empty. "Really?" I replied, completely disconnected from her excuses. "You were always so busy," she went on, her voice quivering. "I needed someone to talk to." "Busy?" I nearly scoffed. "So your solution was to connect with another man?" Her eyes flared with anger as she snapped. "I didn't sleep with him." Her voice was sharp, defensive. "I didn't sleep with anyone." The sudden burst of emotion caught me off guard, but I wasn't thrown off. She was still trying to twist the narrative, hoping I'd believe her, thinking that if there was no physical betrayal, it somehow didn't count. But I didn't need her to confess. I already knew the truth. "You're lying," I said, standing up, no longer willing to endure this charade. "Do you really think I'm that gullible? You've been hiding this for 5 months, and now you expect me to believe it was all just innocent conversations." She stood too, her eyes filling with tears I knew all too well were for show. She had used those tears as a weapon before, but this time they wouldn't work on me. "Please, you have to believe me," she begged, her voice desperate. I never wanted this to happen. I didn't want it to go this far. It was a mistake. I looked at her, feeling nothing but a mix of emptiness and fury. It felt surreal, standing face to face with someone I once trusted, watching as her lies crumbled. She was scrambling to save what little was left, but I wasn't going to give her that chance. Was it a mistake when you mocked me in your messages? My voice was sharp, slicing through the air. Did you feel guilty when you called me a poor fool? Were you ashamed then? Her face froze, as if I had physically struck her. She hadn't expected that. She didn't know I had seen everything. Yes, I continued, crossing my arms. I saw it all. Every message. I can't wait to see you again, and how you laughed at how naive I was, how easy it was to fool me. Her tears were flowing freely now, but they meant nothing to me anymore. She had used them too many times before. Not this time. Not after everything I had uncovered. I didn't mean any of that, she sobbed, stepping toward me, trying to grab my hand. I was confused. It didn't mean anything. But I wasn't falling for it again. Not now, not ever. Please, she pleaded, her voice trembling and cracking. I beg you, believe me. I pulled my hand away, shaking my head in disbelief and anger. Believe you? After all the lies? After everything I found out? She collapsed to the floor, her knees hitting the ground as her body was racked with sobs. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with every cry. But I stood there, cold, detached. I felt nothing, no pity, no sadness, just the overwhelming weight of her betrayal. Did you really think you could hide this forever? I asked, watching her unravel. Her tears poured uncontrollably, her face streaked with emotion. You thought I'd never find out? That I'd keep playing the fool while you lived your double life behind my back? She didn't respond, only weeping softly, her sobs barely audible, muffled by her trembling hands. At that moment, something inside me shifted. A sharp clarity cut through the fog of emotion. Her excuses, her tears, her pleas, they didn't matter anymore. There was no redemption. No explanation could undo what had already been done. Straightening up, my voice was calm but firm. Get up, she looked up at me, her tear-streaked face swollen with fear and confusion as she wiped her cheeks. What she whispered, her voice barely audible. I said, get up, I repeated, my tone steely and unyielding. We're not done yet. The truth I was about to reveal would be something she'd never escape from. Trembling, she struggled to her feet, her face pale, her body weak. This wasn't the woman I knew just hours earlier, but I felt nothing. Her tears and pleas had no power over me anymore. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment I would take full control. Sit down, I ordered, my voice cold as ice. She hesitated, her hands shaking as she reached for a tissue, but she obeyed, sinking into the chair and attempting, in vain, to compose herself. I've already spoken to Mason's wife, I said, locking my eyes onto hers, wanting to see the impact of my words. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide in horror. What? What are you talking about? She stammered. You heard me, I replied, my voice as sharp as a knife. I spoke to his wife. She knows everything. My words hit her like a punch. Her lips trembled as she tried to say something, but no words came out. Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating, as I watched her process what I had just revealed. This wasn't just a secret, I continued, leaning in slightly. I wanted the truth to come out. You and Mason thought you could carry on your little affair in the dark, as if your marriages meant nothing. Her breathing quickened, panic rising in her chest, her face draining of color. I called her 2 days ago, I said, my gaze never leaving hers. Her voice was barely a whisper. What did you tell her? I told her everything, I said, a cruel smile creeping onto my face. I sent her the photos, the messages, every detail. Her face contorted in horror as the full realization hit her. No, 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 she muttered under her breath, shaking her head in disbelief, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. You didn't. You couldn't have. I did, I replied, my voice steady and calm. She wasn't exactly thrilled to learn her husband had been meeting you at hotels, I continued, and I imagine Mason is getting a similar reaction right about now. I watched as her expression shifted from horror to despair, her mind frantically searching for a way out of the mess she had created. Her entire world was collapsing. You've destroyed me, she whispered, her voice trembling, as if I were to blame for the chaos surrounding us. You've ruined my life completely, she repeated, her words shaking with emotion. The sheer audacity of her statement almost made me want to laugh. I ruined your life. I couldn't believe she had the nerve to say that to me now. You betrayed 43 years of marriage. This is on you, I stated firmly, cutting off any chance for her to twist the narrative. You destroyed your life the moment you decided to betray me. Suddenly, she shoved her chair back, the legs screeching against the floor, and the chair toppled over. Her eyes were wide with panic. I didn't want it to end like this. I never thought it would go this far. Mason and I was confused. I thought you didn't care anymore. That you didn't love me like you used to there. It was her attempt to spin the situation around, to shift the blame onto me. Irritation bubbled up inside me, threatening to break through. That's your excuse. You didn't feel loved, so you found comfort in another man's arms. A married man's arms. My voice was cold. Her voice cracked as she shouted back, I was lonely. I didn't know what else to do. You were so distant, always focused on everything but me. And Mason. He listened to me. He made me feel important. Do you even understand what that means? A heavy silence fell over the room, her words hanging in the air. But all I could feel was the cold truth sinking in. Nothing she said could undo the damage. No excuses or pleas could erase the betrayal. I took a deep breath, letting the silence weigh on her before I responded. Do you hear yourself? My voice was quiet, almost calm. Do you really think I'll believe this nonsense about not feeling loved? Every relationship has tough times, but what you did, you chose to destroy everything we built. For what? Cheap hotel meetups. A few stolen moments. Her lips quivered, but she said nothing, realizing that no words could make up for what she had done. I had doubts too, I continued. There were times when I felt distant. But you know what I didn't do? I didn't run into someone else's arms. I leaned in closer, locking eyes with her. You had a choice. You could have come to me. We could have worked through it. But instead, you chose Mason. So don't stand here and tell me I ruined your life. You made your choice, and now you'll have to live with the consequences. She stood there, small and broken, her tears still streaming down her face. But her excuses had run dry. She knew there was no escaping it now, no lie, no clever reasoning could hide the truth. I pulled out my phone, tapped a few times, and placed it face up on the table. You should listen to this, I said, my voice calm. I pressed play, and the sound of their voices from the hotel filled the room. At first it was a bit muffled, but soon her soft laughter and his whispers became clear. They had no idea they were being recorded. Her face turned pale. How? How did you? She stammered. Remember the Bluetooth speaker you always carried in your bag, I said, my voice cold and steady. I borrowed it. You didn't even check before running off to your meeting. She looked like she was about to be sick. Panic filled her eyes as she realized she was trapped, with no way out. You can deny it all you want, I said, nodding at the phone, which continued to play the damning recording. But this is enough proof for me. It's over. Her hands trembled as she stared at me, a mix of fear and defeat on her face. The tears had dried up. There were no more excuses, just a suffocating silence between us. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my tone firm but composed, and I think it's time you start packing. She didn't resist. She didn't even try to argue. She just stood there, staring at the floor as her carefully constructed world crumbled beneath her feet. In that moment, I felt an odd sense of calm. This chapter was finally closing. She froze, processing my words, her shoulders slumped, the color drained from her face. For the first time, she looked completely defeated. No more fake tears, no more desperate lies. Pack your things, I repeated, my voice steady, with finality. Go to Mason, if you want. I don't care. Her face twisted at the mention of his name, torn between regret and fear. She was finally realizing just how far she had gone, how deep the damage was. This wasn't just about us anymore, it was about her, Mason, and the mess they had created. I'll leave, she whispered, her voice hollow. She didn't look at me, just turned and headed toward the stairs, moving like she was in a trance, her body operating on autopilot. I watched as she slowly ascended the stairs, feeling an odd sense of relief that the truth was out. No more lies, no more wondering if I was being paranoid. It was all in the open now, harsh and undeniable. The betrayal was exposed, and now we had to face the fallout. As she packed upstairs, I sat back down at the kitchen table, staring at the half-eaten dinner I had made. It felt like it belonged to another life. Just an hour ago, I had been playing the part of the unsuspecting husband while she spun her web of lies, and I had patiently waited for the right moment to tear it all down. Now, with everything unraveled, the house felt stifling, like the air had been sucked out, leaving behind only an eerie silence. The rage and disgust that had once burned within me like wildfire had cooled, leaving behind only a cold emptiness. A part of me had already moved on, distancing itself from the wreckage she left behind. 10 minutes passed before she came downstairs, a small suitcase clutched in her hand. Her face was pale, and she avoided my gaze. I could tell she wanted to say something, maybe offer a weak excuse or a final plea. Perhaps she was hanging on to a last shred of dignity, but she stayed silent, knowing there was nothing left to say. "I'll stay with a friend tonight," she mumbled, barely audible. I nodded, indifferent to where she went. It didn't matter anymore. She could go anywhere, as long as it wasn't here. She paused at the door, gripping the handle tightly, as if debating whether to turn back. For a second, I thought she might speak, maybe offer one last apology, but she remained frozen, unable to move. Then, without a word, she opened the door and left. The soft click of the door closing behind her echoed through the house, louder than anything else. That night I sat there, staring at the door for what seemed like forever, waiting for the wave of emotions to crash over me. But it never did. There was no breakdown, no overwhelming rush of feelings, just a strange, unsettling silence. It felt surreal, as if I wasn't living my own life anymore. The woman I had spent years with was gone, but instead of feeling shattered, all I felt was closure. I remained there, unmoving, for what felt like hours, replaying the night's events in my mind again and again, her lies, the confrontation, the fear in her eyes when she realized how much I knew. I had anticipated some sort of emotional release, a moment where I'd feel something, but it never came. My mind wandered to Mason, to his wife, to the disaster we were all heading toward. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But at least for tonight, the storm had calmed. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, thinking it might be Kyle with an update, but it wasn't him, it was Mason's wife. Ever since I had told her everything, we had kept in touch, each dealing with it in our own way, silently and thoughtfully. The message was short: "He's gone too. Only guilt remains." I stared at her words, imagining Mason walking away in shame, just as my wife had. I didn't feel sorry for him. In fact, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. It seemed almost poetic. He and my wife had built their own secret world, and now, just like ours, that world was falling apart. Still, as I read her message, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. The affair had come to light, the confrontations had happened, but there was a sense of finality missing, something unresolved. The memories of her leaving weren't the only things haunting me. Everything that followed weighed on my mind, keeping sleep at bay. The divorce was inevitable, of course, but how do you piece together a life that's been reduced to ruins? Where do you begin when the foundation you stood on has completely collapsed? I leaned back in my chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as fragments of conversations, shared moments, and broken promises swirled in my head. And then there was Mason. I couldn't help but wonder if he was sitting in the wreckage of his own life, trying to understand how everything had gone so horribly wrong. It was clear that neither of them had anticipated this outcome. My wife had always been so confident, certain that her double life would remain hidden forever. She probably thought she could juggle both worlds without ever being caught, without ever facing the consequences. But secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? Once they're exposed, there's no way to bury them again. Eventually, I stood up, stretched, and walked to the window. Outside, everything was still and quiet. It felt as though the world had moved on, leaving me behind. Maybe it had. Maybe it had. Maybe that was the next step moving forward. The house, now engulfed in eerie silence, echoed with emptiness. No more of her footsteps, no clinking of dishes in the kitchen, not even the faint sound of her favorite podcast playing in the background while she pretended to work. Just silence. Her departure had drained the life out of the house, leaving behind nothing but a hollow shell. But instead of the sadness or loneliness I had expected, I felt something else, a sense of relief. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, I could finally breathe deeply, no longer holding my breath. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept replaying our confrontation in my mind, her weak excuses, the look on her face when I told her that Mason's wife knew everything. I pictured Mason going through the same unraveling, watching his life collapse under the weight of his deceit. For a brief moment, I wondered if they regretted it. Did she? But then it struck me regret wouldn't change anything. Not for me, and certainly not for them. By morning, my mind was clear. My decision had solidified. This wasn't just about the end of a marriage, it was about reclaiming control of my life, rebuilding what she had tried to destroy. I wasn't going to let her betrayal define me or pull me into the same pit of lies and misery that she had fallen into. If anything, this was my chance to start over, and I was determined to make the most of it. As soon as the sun rose, I called my lawyer. We had already gone over the details to get the process started, but now I wanted to move things along faster. I had no interest in dragging this out, no desire to give her another opportunity to twist things in her favor. The call with my lawyer was short and straightforward. He assured me we had everything necessary for a quick and smooth divorce. After all the chaos she had caused, she had nothing left to fight for. Next on my list was Mason's wife. I felt like I owed her more than just a phone call. We had both been thrown into this nightmare without warning, and though we were handling the aftermath in our own ways, we shared a common bond, at least for now. I didn't need anything from her, but it felt right to close that chapter properly. So I called her that same day, keeping my voice calm but direct. She picked up on the second ring, her voice steady, almost too steady, as if the shock had passed, and she was simply dealing with the aftermath. "How are you holding up?" I asked, unsure of how else to start the conversation. There was a pause on the other end. "All right, I guess," she answered after a moment. As all right as you can be after finding out your husband has been cheating on you for 5 months, her tone was bitter, but there was something else there: acceptance. It seemed like she had already come to terms with it, like she had already decided how she was going to move forward. Maybe that's how it was, I thought. In some ways she seemed stronger than me. "I know this is hard to accept," I said softly, finally breaking the silence that had fallen between us. "I just wanted to check in, to see how you're doing." Her response dripped with sarcasm. "How am I holding up? You mean, how am I coping with the fact that we're both married to liars?" She let out a hollow, joyless laugh. "Yeah, we're doing just great." There was a brief pause before her tone softened. "Thanks for telling me. I know it wasn't easy for you." "No, it wasn't," I admitted quietly, "but you deserve to know. Better you hear it from me than find out later, some other way." She sighed heavily. "Yeah, you're probably right. I've already kicked him out," she said. "He claims he's staying with a friend, but honestly I don't care where he goes as long as it's not here." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I get it." I told her to leave too. Silence lingered between us, both trying to wrap our heads around the oddness of our situation, two strangers brought together by the same betrayal. The absurdity of it suddenly hit me. "I wonder how long they thought they could keep it hidden," she asked, breaking the quiet. "How long did they believe we wouldn't figure it out? Did they honestly think we were blind or just stupid?" I smirked grimly. "Oh, I'm sure they thought they had us completely fooled. They probably believed they could string it along forever." "Well, they were wrong," she said, her voice now filled with a fresh determination. "Both of them were wrong." There wasn't much left to say after that. The conversation was winding down, but before we ended the call, she asked something I hadn't considered. "So what now? What are you going to do now that everything's out in the open?" It was a simple question, but I hadn't really thought about it. I had been so focused on uncovering the truth and confronting it that I hadn't considered what came next. Now that the dust was settling, what would I do? "I don't know," I admitted, leaning back in my chair. "Maybe I'll start fresh, take some time to finally focus on myself." She chuckled softly. "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I think I'll do the same." After we hung up, I sat there for a long while, staring out the window. Life outside kept moving forward, but I felt stuck, frozen, as if I were trying to catch my breath. But I knew I couldn't stay like this forever. I couldn't keep replaying her lies or reliving the betrayal over and over. I had to let go for my own sake. That evening, I started cleaning out the house. Her things were still scattered everywhere: clothes, shoes, small items she hadn't taken with her. I packed everything into bags and boxes, not caring where they would end up. I just needed them gone. I needed to reclaim this space and make it mine again. With every item I threw into a bag, it felt like I was shedding another layer of the past, letting go of another piece of her that no longer belonged in my life. When I finished, the house felt emptier, but also lighter. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking around at the space that had once been ours, but was now mine alone. It felt strange, but somehow it seemed right. The legal side of the divorce was almost wrapped up, and soon everything would be official. But I knew that emotionally, this was far from over. Healing would take time, and I was okay with that. There was no rush anymore. For the first time in a long time, I could move at my own pace. I didn't know where life would take me in the next few months, or even in a year, but one thing was clear: I was no longer the naive fool she had mocked in her messages. The one who couldn't see the obvious. I had regained control, and now I was ready to rebuild my life on my own terms. Standing there, alone but not broken, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: hope. Each day, the numbness that had gripped me after everything happened slowly began to fade. The house had become much quieter, and at first, the silence was overwhelming, almost suffocating. But as I began to reclaim my space, the quiet became easier to handle. In the first few days, I spent most of my time doing mundane chores: laundry, washing dishes, sorting through her old belongings. It felt pointless, but it kept me busy, kept me from being idle. It was like I was slowly clearing the slate, starting over. There was something almost therapeutic about it, even if the weight of what had happened still lingered. The memory of her and Mason haunted me more than I wanted to admit, not because I missed her, not at all. It was the questions that tormented me. How could the woman I had trusted for so many years become a stranger to me so quickly? How had I missed all the signs? These thoughts followed me everywhere, creeping in during quiet moments, whispering when I was alone. The betrayal hurt far more deeply than I initially realized, and no amount of cleaning or packing away her things could erase the scars it left. But I was determined. I wouldn't let her betrayal define who I became. I made a decision to focus on myself. It started with small steps. I began running again, going to the gym more often, and cooking real meals instead of relying on takeout every night. The more I invested in myself, the more I felt like I was coming back to life. This newfound freedom was something I wasn't used to. There was no one to consult, no one to tiptoe around anymore. It was just me and my thoughts, which grew clearer with each passing day. I began thinking about the things I had put off for years: dreams, hobbies, plans I had pushed aside for the sake of us. But now, for the first time in a long while, there was no us, there was only me. And honestly, it felt liberating. A few weeks after she left, I could finally breathe again. The divorce papers had been filed, and the process was in motion. There were no fights, no drawn-out battles. She didn't even try to contest it. I think she realized it was over, that there was no point. As for Mason, he had his own problems to deal with. From what I heard through mutual friends, his life had fallen apart too. Karma has a funny way of catching up with people. One evening, I was sitting in the backyard, watching the sunset. The sky shifted from warm oranges to soft pinks, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. I held a beer in my hand, just enjoying the stillness. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about her. I wasn't replaying the betrayal in my head. I was just in the moment. Then, my phone buzzed, breaking the silence. I glanced at the screen. It was Kyle, the private investigator who had been with me through the toughest moments. We hadn't spoken much after everything went down, though he would check in on me from time to time. This time, his message was short and cryptic. "You won't believe what I found out today. Call me when you have a minute." The message immediately grabbed my attention, stirring up a surge of curiosity. What now? I thought this nightmare was over. The affair had been revealed, the marriage was beyond repair, and the divorce was already in motion. What else could still be unresolved? Yet my curiosity won, and I dialed Kyle's number, expecting a brief update, maybe news about Mason or my soon-to-be ex-wife. "Hello," Kyle's voice answered after just a couple of rings, calm but carrying a hint of tension. "Glad you called me back," he said. "You've got my attention," I responded, settling back in my chair. "What's this about?" There was a pause on his end, as if he was carefully selecting his words. "I did some extra digging, went beyond what you asked for when you filed for divorce. I thought it was over, but something kept nagging at me." A sense of dread began to creep in. "What do you mean?" "I kept an eye on Mason after everything came out, just to be sure there wasn't more happening behind the scenes, and I found something," Kyle said, pausing again to let the tension build. "Mason wasn't the first." A cold wave crashed over me. "What are you saying?" "She had other affairs. Mason wasn't the first, and he wasn't the only one. She's been cheating much longer than you may have realized. Mason was just the latest in a long string." A sickening feeling hit me. "How do you know this?" "I have evidence: letters, messages. This has been going on for 3 years. The crushing weight of this new betrayal settled over me. Just when I thought I had uncovered the worst, another secret emerged, one she had managed to keep hidden all this time. I barely managed to ask, how long? How many lies has she told me? I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. Kyle continued, his voice steady but firm. But now I've got everything. I sat there, stunned, trying to absorb his words. It felt like another betrayal, but this time the pain wasn't as sharp. It was more like a dull ache, something I seemed to have unknowingly braced myself for. "Send me what you have," I finally said, my voice hollow. "I need to see it." Kyle agreed, and shortly after, my phone buzzed with new emails and screenshots. But I didn't open them immediately. Instead, I just stared at the screen, feeling a mix of emotions: anger, yes, but also an unexpected sense of relief. Anger at how deep the betrayal had gone, but relief that I finally knew the full truth. There was nothing left to save. I no longer needed her explanations. I didn't need her version of closure. I was free. Later that evening, I deleted every message, every file Kyle had sent. I realized I didn't need to hold on to this chapter of my life any longer. I had all the answers I needed, but more importantly, I had found the closure I'd been seeking. As I sat there watching the last bits of daylight fade away, something new stirred within me. It wasn't just hope, it was something deeper. Maybe even excitement for what lay ahead. I had survived the storm, come through it, and now I was ready to begin again. This chapter of my life was finally over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I looked forward to the future. A year later, my ex-wife Anna suffered a stroke after losing her job. She barely managed to keep herself afloat. Our 2 children, having learned about her actions, cut off all contact with her. From what I've heard, Anna's condition is severe, and she can't take care of herself. The only ones helping her are volunteers who assist her in surviving day to day. Just a year ago, she couldn't have imagined that her life would unravel this way, but she had destroyed it herself, and now she bears the responsibility for it. My friend, that's where this story ends. If you like this tale, don't forget to give it a royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the Force be with you.